Hello, all. Today we are going to do the first part of Lecture 5. I've broken Lecture 5 into two sections, the European and then an African. So, what we're covering is colonial America. We're focusing on the mid 1600s through the mid 1700s. The one I will start with today is the British and the European element of colonial America. The next lecture will be the African influence. So, with today, the big thing to focus on are three major key points: are declension, indentured servitude, and the Great Awakening. All right. So, with that being said, let's go into and talk about the European aspect of colonial America. Kind of give you an overview as far as population goes. Basically by the time we left off with the last lecture with the English and the Turkey too, right around the 1640s, you've got roughly 178,000 Brits settling in the colonies. By 1750, starting to move out of colonial and into what would be revolutionary America, you have 1.3 million. All right, so you have a increase. Not only is it because the British keep sending people over more and more, but the birth rate drastically increases while here. Another thing that starts up is people start living longer. As far as another little aspect that you need to know is gender. There was only one woman to every 6 men in colonial America. So you had a lot more men here than you did women. And it was especially lopsided in the South, where most people in the South came over as indentured servants. In the North, you do have a familial economy. You do have people coming over as families. Some, but by large, the large number are of men coming over. All right. Also, this is, for the most part, most of these people are British peasantry, and not of aristocratic birth. Not all of them. I mean, most of them are anyway. With this, in the North and in the South, family and community means everything. All right. So with family and community, this idea of an agricultural world. All right. Also, land. The big thing is land. These are agricultural people. In the South, in the North, everybody is agricultural. Almost everybody. Also, you do have a kind of a European structure with class, but the class structure here is based on wealth more than blood. All right. By wealth during this time, that means land. Those that have the most land are the wealthiest. Also, during this time frame, everything is in flux. Colonial America is still, in many ways, very similar to what life was like back in England, but you have a lot more opportunities, in that there's plenty of space, plenty of food, plenty of land. So keep it in mind. Also, let's go from north to south. All right. Northern economy, it tended to be agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. All right. So with this, you do, like I said, have this agricultural way of life. you do have a crop that is usually being grown for sale. Also, you have livestock, cows, pigs, sheep, many things. Also, fishing is very big in colonial New England. With all of this, you have a familial economy. All right. Like I said, in the North, a lot of families came over, and a lot of families worked and farmed together. It would be the mom and the girl's job to take care of the home, the garden, and the livestock. Also, the young men would follow around and learn from their mother first, and once they got to an age where they were competent enough, they would go off into the fields with dad. So you have this familial structure. Everybody in the family plays a critical role in the family economy. All right. All in all, this made a lot of money for the British Empire. On average, the northern colonies pulled in right around 450,000 pounds a year. So they made good money for the crown. The crown was pleased. Remember, early on, and when we were talking about it first with the coming of the separatists in Plymouth, the Puritans in Boston, and Salem, you've got religious groups, these Protestant religious groups. And this was a major part of their society. I don't know, when I was growing up, I heard this all the time. Don't be so puritanical, which means basically, don't be so conservative. Don't be so religiously conservative. The Puritans and the Separatists were and viewed themselves as soldiers of God. So they had a very distinct view of the world. All right. Since they saw themselves as soldiers for God, that means that they were at war with the devil and his minions. So they saw evil everywhere they looked. All right. But this would lessen through time. One of the key points, the first one of the day for you guys, is declension. This is when the newer generations, the younger generations, started moving away from their puritanical and separatist roots. They started to become more mercantile, more modern in their views on life. This was to the horror of their relatives and their parents and the older generations. But like I said, the kids would move away from very conservative religious background to a more money-based, secular way of life. And it continues to this day. So we have declension, this moving away from the old religious ways to a more secular way of being. But you got to remember that in colonial America, this is a very, very conservative time. In some ways. One of them is they did believe in witches, and that witches were the minions of Satan. You've all, I'm sure, heard of the Salem witch trials. All right. With the Salem witch trials, these young teenage girls said this slave woman, Tabitula, cursed them with an evil eye and made them sick. The evil eye that she gave her made them vomit, have diarrhea, intense stomach cramps, and headaches, and hallucinations. Right? And she would be taken before court and asked if she was a witch. She would say yes and repent and be freed. Many other Puritans were accused of being witches, and they refused to repent because they said they weren't witches. And they'd be tried, found guilty. Some were hung, some were pressed. You may not know what pressed is. Pressed is where they lay you down flat on the ground and stack giant rocks on you until it basically crushes you to death. Also, In the Salem witch trials, they also executed a dog for being a witch. So, with the witch trials in Salem, this mania would spread. This is usually taught in history as a hysteria, but there is a theory out there. Some people like it. I think it's a great story, so I always tell it to you guys. There is a possibility that the Salem witch hunt and trials were all fueled by a thing called ergot, Ergot. It's a fungus that grows on the grain sometimes in the Northeast and throughout America. One of the things is with this fungus, it's not always there, but when it is, it's in large quantities, and it's on the grain. You really can't see it on the grain, and when you bake the bread with the grain, what ends up happening is it activates this. So it is possible that this fungus, that is a hallucinogen, was the cause of the Salem witch trials. It is one of the stories I really like. I think it's interesting, a really great story. The idea that the Salem witch trials was a bad trip, right? So, with the witch trials, with all these things, these would slowly over time fade away, kind of because of declension and many other things, and people moving away from the religious ways of life. The Puritans would come to dominate New England. The separatists would pretty much be forgotten. By the 1700s and into the 1800s, the separatists were known as Congregationalists. It's a small church, and they don't really factor into much anymore. But the Puritans would come over in large numbers and end up dominating the New England landscape during the colonial time frame. Other things about these guys. I mean, as far as the Puritans go, they were very conservative in their spirituality, but they had different ideas of the secular, of everyday life. For example, with dating, all right, they practice what's known as bundling. To kind of get you up to date on that. Once a girl was of age, dating really started, and they would start looking for mates fairly quickly. This way they would get married, start having kids, and the community would help them build their farm up, their barn, their house, get them all ready to go. And to get that, this familial economy, to keep it going like it had been in the North, bundling was part of the practice. So a young man in the neighborhood would fall in love or fall in like with a girl and start hanging around on the front porch with them and sitting on the benches. If the father and the mother approved, they would bring them over for supper. And a typical date night would be starting on the benches outside, then going into supper, and then after supper, they would strip down the kids, wrap cloth or sacks around them with rope, and put them in bed together. This was meant as a date night so they could get to know each other and spend private time with one another, but at the same time it was meant to, keep the kids from getting pregnant. Sackcloth, not a very good prophylactic. Sooner or later the kids would end up pregnant, married off, and have their own families. But you don't see that kind of date night around anymore. But that was, bundling was a form of dating at that time. All right. Along with the North, you also have the southern colonies. Um, the southern colonies tended to be agricultural as well, but instead of a familial economy, it was definitely a plantation economy. Rice, indigo, and tobacco. Those three were the cash crops of the South in this plantation system. Okay, with those crops, the southern planters brought in somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million pounds a year for the British Crown. Lots and lots of money. This was a very profitable experience for the British Crown. Early on, during the colonial era, with the founding of Jamestown and on into the time we're talking about today, you do have slavery. In slavery, the first slaves would come over in 1617, but it would slowly grow and grow. By the end of the 1600s, you really get a solidification of racial slavery as the major mode, well, as the major labor force in the South on these plantations. Before racial slavery, you had indentured servitude. Remember, most of the people that came over to Jamestown and into the South were poor. A lot of them were orphans, a lot of them were children, and they would be sent over. The large majority of them would be men, and they would be sent over to work, all right, as indentured servants, which is basically indentured servitude is temporary slavery, all right. To be an indentured servant, you usually served anywhere from 2 to 5 years, all right, sometimes 7. So think about it, you'd be brought over, everything would be paid for, but once you were here, you were that person's slave for 2 to 7 years, all right? This was meant to be the way you paid off your passage and your care, all right? In this, you were treated no better than a slave was later. 2 out of every 5 indentured servants would die in servitude. Disease, lack of food, many other things, just the harsh treatment and the harsh working conditions that these men would be put under. All right. Roughly 3/4, that's 75% of the southern population came over as an indentured servant during the colonial era. All right. So out of about 75% of the whites that would come, 75% of them, like I said, 75% of these whites would be indentured servants. This led to a very rough and tumble life. You got to remember, this is mainly men living in these conditions. There was no real push for religion. These guys, once they did, when they didn't have to work, tended to drink, party. They liked blood sports, cockfighting, bear baiting, dog fights, any kind of blood sport was very, very enjoyed by these guys. Of course, cards, dice, anything and everything. So these men, that's what they tended to spend their time doing: drinking, gambling, fighting. Boys will be boys. All right. However, the whole idea was to come here. Once you did get here, you would be able to work your time and get land. Some of the men looked forward to it. Some of the owners, I guess you could say the slaveholders, the ones that held the contracts on these indentured servants, would promise acres and seed after they were done. But if not, they could save up. And most of the ones that made it out did do that. They tried to get their own little plot of land, live their own life after the indentured servitude was up. So you really have 2 very different worlds. You have the familial economy of the North, right? You have this world where family is the focus. Religion plays a big role. And it's very kind of conservative, right? But you also have the South that's raucous, that is based on the plantation system that Columbus would bring in with the encomienda. All right. Along with this, we need to talk about the colonial mind. And with the colonial mind, we're going to focus on religion, education, and the Enlightenment. All right. We'll talk about these three things, and this is what we'll wrap up with for this first part of the lecture on, the British colonies. And with this, let's start with religion. And also, you've already had declension, you've had indentured servitude, your first two key points, and now we're going to talk about the third key point, which is the Great Awakening. All right. The Great Awakening is a religious revival. All right. It sweeps through the British Isles and comes to America. And most of the places it has the biggest influence is in the North. All right. The first Great Awakening is from the 1730s to the 1770s. All right. This is, in many ways, kind of what you would think of as evangelical or revivalistic. This is promoting a Christianity, a Protestant Christianity, that is very personal, about one's personal relationship with God, and very experiential. So it's an emotional, personal experience and attachment to God. It is not based on a church or a preacher communing and telling you what God wants of you and you obeying. It's these Great Awakenings kind of kickstart this evangelical idea of Protestantism that's around today. And one of the important things that comes out of this first Great Awakening is this is what introduces the American colonist to the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, and the Presbyterian Church, the big three Protestant denominations in American history: the Baptist, the Methodist, and the Presbyterians. So we have this big religious revival that sweeps through. It has a bigger impact in the North, and with declension, moving them away from Puritanism, this revivalism makes it easier to have a personal religion than this very strict, focused religion that is, where you're really living a life according to your preacher. Also, this does filter down into the South, and these churches would have an impact and an influence on these wild and crazy men of the South. Not a big one at first, but it would grow through time. Also, another important thing to bring in is education. Education was extremely important. Not as much in the South, but it really was in the North. Families, and being able to read, basic math, just basic education was very important. Like I said, more so in the North than in the South at this time. But on average, about half of the colonial white population could read. That was extremely good during this time in world history. All right. The last thing that we're going to get into is the Enlightenment. This would play a very, very big role. All right. The main components of the Enlightenment that I want to focus on are humanism and rationalism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a definition of humanism and then rationalism, and we'll talk a little bit about what the Enlightenment was. All right. Humanism: an outlook or system of thought attaching prime importance to human rather than divine or supernatural matters. Humanist beliefs stress the potential value and goodness of human beings, emphasize common human needs, and seek solely rational ways of solving human problems. All right. John Locke, a British philosopher and a major player in the Enlightenment and scientific revolution, pushes this idea of humanism, especially in several of his treatises, but also in his idea of tabula rasa. Tabula rasa means blank slate. And for Locke, he believed that we were born blank slates. We are not born evil, like it's pushed by the Catholic Church or Christianity or most religions. We are not born sinful. We are born blank slates. So the idea with this tabula rasa is through good education, through good environment, through good teaching, through good things, we make better people. All right? So we have humanism. This idea of leaving the divine and supernatural out of human affairs, focus on what we can do to improve ourselves. All right. The other aspect of this is rationalism. All right. With rationalism, a little definition for you for the time of the Enlightenment: a belief or theory that opinions and actions should be based on reason and knowledge rather than on religious belief or emotional response. So, with humanism and rationalism, people like Voltaire, John Locke, David Hume, many others would push that the man is innately good. Given the right environment, the right education, the right spirituality, the right everything, we can make a better world. All right. The big focus is on a better education, a better environment. All right. This idea of we are secular beings creating a better world. All right. They push this idea that human reason should determine understanding of the world and the rules of our social life. Right? This plays a big role in influencing our founding fathers. People like Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, Washington. These ideas of the Enlightenment play a huge role in shaping what America would be founded on. And this is the basic ideology that we are founded on. These Enlightenment thinkers and later the scientific revolution thinkers would play a big role in shaping how the founding fathers saw the world. And for them, this Enlightenment and scientific revolution is what they would create, well, it's what they would make be the foundation of this American experiment. All right. With this, hopefully, you got a little bit out of it, things you hadn't heard before, things you didn't know. And like I told you, this is our first part of the colonial series. I wanted to zero in and focus on the British influence. All right. Everybody have a good evening.